thank you for being such brave souls to come out this evening. Also want to welcome Byzantine Relic. It's his sign in on the internet that's been watching us. Nikki in Clifton, Virginia. Andrew in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And Joe in Rocket River, Ohio. Have all contacted us in the last week or so. So we welcome you and everyone that happens to be watching the videos on the internet. And we have many of local people in the parish, and even some that have been able to come, and when they miss here, there's one lady that has been very active in attending and can't at the moment with her schedule, but was here today to pick up the material because she's watching them at home when her schedule permits her to do that. So, okay, I don't know what page we left off on last time. I know where we quit. The new page tonight's got a different number. Trust me, it's okay. It's where we're starting. And I'll figure out later what happened, but I haven't had time to figure that out of why the new page numbers is different. So I think you're on page 273. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. As a brief refresher, very brief, we are talking about the passage where in Colossians 1:15, St. Paul says, Christ is the icon of the invisible God. We are exploring the meaning of icon, what that means beyond just what we normally think of as an icon. What is the function of that, and what does it mean that Christ is, in this case, a living icon of the invisible source of the entire universe. And so we're exploring that, beginning to move into thinking about, in not just a superficial way, what it means for us, and the relationship of the visible icon that we see with that which is invisible. What is that relationship that is there, so that the visible is more than just a blinking light that says, oh, by the way, don't forget there's the invisible. That the relationship is closer than that. It's not just a blinking sign saying, remember, the invisible is out there. What is this relationship? So we're going to explore that a little bit to begin with this evening. We forgot how to see the invisible. We forgot how to see the invisible. Once upon a time, in every one of our lives, we could see the invisible, which is to say, once upon a time, we could see the whole. We could see everything. For several months, our son, his wife, and 4 children lived with us when his company transferred him back to Oklahoma City, and they were in between houses. During the time they were living with us, I had occasion, in fact, I had multiple occasions of noticing their youngest son, my grandson Grady, at the stage between learning to crawl and walking. I particularly watched Grady crawl across the kitchen floor to the doorway to the den, 2 steps down below. Grady crawled to the doorway, reached across the threshold, but found no floor on the other side. After several times trying over many days, Grady reached across the threshold and reached downward to that step below. For perhaps a week, he crawled to the door, reached across the threshold, and touched the step below. Then one day, he crawled. It obviously hasn't been edited. Then one day, he crawled to the threshold, looked down at the step below, and with his right hand held on to the doorpost, the doorway, and reached over, and with his left hand could touch that step below. Now Grady repeated holding on to the edge of the doorway and reaching down and touching the step with his left hand for a day or two, each time leaning more and more further out and downward on his left hand. I watched with amazement as he finally pushed most of his weight through the door and pitched forward. His left hand and arm, unable to support his weight, gave way, pulling his right arm that was hanging on off, thrusting it then quickly out in front of himself, trying to break his fall on the steps below. He didn't. I was surprised that he didn't start crying, but he didn't. It, I guess, didn't hurt his nose too much. Nonetheless, for wear, he sat on his bottom, turned around to look back into the kitchen from whence he had come. And then he proceeded to crawl upward and back into the kitchen. Soon Grady was crawling everywhere through the house. It was not long before Grady took his first step and began learning to walk. I watched as Grady walked across the kitchen to the doorway into the den. When he came to the doorway, he sat down and crawled into the den and then stood up and walked across the den everywhere. He wasn't ready to make that step downward. Then one day he walked to the doorway, turned sideways, on which he put both hands on side of the door and then could put one foot down and the other one down and then turn. Well, while I'm very proud of Grady, as I am of all of my children and my grandchildren, this does not prove or make him a genius. Each and every one of us, once upon a time, did the very same thing. Meaning, we saw, knew, figured something out without language. No words. We saw and somehow knew and then knew what to do without any words at all. We knew without words. We saw it without words. I have described what I saw watching him with words, and you were able to picture what I said from my words. But Grady had no words. He was not yet speaking. He was not yet mimicking or repeating sounds that were spoken to him in any significant kind of way. Over the course of time, I watched all this happen. As I watched all this happen, I watched as Grady became aware of a world that was larger than himself. He was aware of something out there, someplace at least 2 to 3 feet in front of him. He was aware. He had absolutely no words with which to know it, and therefore no words telling him how to see it, to see what was outside of and in front of him. He knew what he knew without words. When he came to the doorway into the den, he knew there was a step down without knowing the word step or the word down. He knew what he knew without any words telling him what he knew. Something occurred when Grady began walking. It was not long after he learned to walk that Grady began learning to talk. Like Helen Keller in the movie The Miracle Worker, learning how to associate the experience of Annie Sullivan's fingers tapping on her palm with the experience of the other hand under the water, the pump, this experience associated with that experience, with that same experience beginning to lead to something else, Grady began associating sounds with objects. Instead of a tapping with objects, it was just the sound, water, water. Soon he knew some nouns and could ask for something simply by saying the noun milk, cheese, grape. It was significant the day he could say 3 syllables, grandfather. I couldn't pass that one up. Nouns are concrete, solid objects. We know the names, the words for objects. Rational knowledge is objective knowledge. The knowledge of objects. That's why it's called objective knowledge. We know objects. Now, verbs are trickier. Verbs are associated with behavior, either active or passive. Verbs are taught not by mimicking the sound of a word, but really by doing or mimicking the behavior. It's how we learn. You're trying to teach someone to bat, to hit a ball. You do this, and then you have them swing. You learn the verb by doing, not by just associating a sound with an object. Second example, last Sunday, Nicholas, an 11-year-old with Down syndrome, served at the altar. All altar servers approach a priest with their folded vestment held out in front of them to receive a blessing, to vest and serve. This process is repeated for each altar server when they arrive. If the divine liturgy has begun and the priests are now at the altar, it is normal for one of the subdeacons or an adult server to touch a priest lightly on his arm or shoulder to let him know a server needs a blessing. Nicholas was the first to arrive and receive his blessing to vest. All morning through Orthodox and with liturgy just beginning, Nicholas had watched every altar server receive their blessing from a priest. The liturgy had started when a server arrived late. He approached with his folded vestments, and Nicholas immediately went and tapped Father John on the back for him to turn and give the blessing. In fact, this happened twice with Nicholas tapping Father John on the back. Now, every altar server has been verbally instructed to hold out their folded vestments to receive the blessing from the priest. Never has anyone ever been told to tap the priest on the back. Nicholas did not know to tap Father John on the back because he had heard or been taught with words to do it. Quite the opposite. No altar server has ever been taught to either say something or to tap the priest to get his attention. Never. It's one of the adults present that does that. Nicholas knew to do what he did because he had seen it done. He knew something the way Grady knew something because he saw without words and understood. He had knowledge without words. Grady and Nicholas knew without the use of words. They knew what they knew and were able to act upon what they each knew without words, creating either their knowledge or their behavior. Now, Grady now runs everywhere, learning the names of everything. He has entered the linguistic world of secondhand knowledge. No longer experiencing things firsthand, it's all now just objects and names. That's what he's learning. He now knows linguistic knowledge. He knows the exciting world of the name of things. Forgotten because he has no words with which to remember is his experience of knowing without words. He doesn't know or remember what he knew and how he knew it when he crawled through that door. He has now entered the rational world of words and books. See, this is true for each of us. We have forgotten ever seeing the whole and knowing the whole, because what we saw and what we knew were there. We saw and knew without words once in our lives, in a time frame once. Words are a great help to memory. They help us remember what we know. That is, they help us remember so we have not forgotten. We're going to forget it. I forgot. Oh, help me remember. If it's written down, I remember my shopping list when I go to get it. Words help us remember something, but they don't help us remember what we knew before we had words to remember with. You see, words are also portable. They are detached from the experience. We can take the words with us. We can teach others the words. Spoken words can become written words, separated from the experience. See, you were not there watching Grady crawl through the door, but my portable words can describe an event. Separated from the experience itself, now knowledge now exists in books. Totally separated from the experience, knowledge is now portable and transmittable. I never have to experience anything. I can just read it in a book. I can live my whole life traveling the world in a book. Instead of being our servant, helping us live within the whole by helping us remember some stuff, words have now become our master, imprisoning us in a linguistic world that is known where knowledge is only the knowledge of words. I think you've got a wonderful picture there, do you not? That's what I do. I read books and I know things. Do you get the tone of arrogance there? I read books and I know things. I'm a smarty pants. I'm good at Trivial Pursuit and Jeopardy. I know stuff because I read it in a book. And that's what knowledge now is in a rationalistic system of the world. Experience is gone, and it's only the world of words based on objects. And because the invisible is known without words, it must not exist anymore. So without words to remember by, like Grady, we have forgotten ever seeing the whole. By whole, I mean the visible and the invisible together. You see, when Grady was looking there, he could see the whole yeah, he could see, and see, the minute we say that, well, yeah, but visibly he saw X, Y, and Z. We just named all the objects, but how did he know that was a step and it was down? Okay. We have forgotten we can do that. We still have memories, but they are memories remembered with words. Now, there was a time when you may have had a memory of a memory. The memory was without words, and you somehow could still remember it, and then 10, 30 years later, you have only the memory of having, once upon a time I remembered that, but it's no longer alive in me. It's gone. Now, there are those that have been traumatized by events too terrible and horrifying for words, that have unspoken and wordless memories buried deep inside and far from the surface of their lives. I'm wanting us to see the connection between visible and invisible and the reality of it. I was once a chaplain at a reformatory for delinquent teenage girls who had been adjudicated delinquent for serious crimes, some even for murder. They were sentenced to a reformatory because they were not old enough to be sent to prison. I worked alongside 2 psychologists to provide counseling to over 100 teenage girls. Psychologist Don Dyer's office was beside mine. In between counseling sessions, I would sit in Don's office and share with him how I had responded to a child in my last session. I learned more from Don Dyer than I ever had in my courses in psychology. Day after day and week after week, Don began teaching me how to see the invisible. That is, how to see the whole. Don reminded me that these kids were not intellectual riddles to be rationally solved, nor could their lives be fixed by following any rational advice from us. Instead, these kids were angry, hostile, juvenile delinquents that were mysteries that needed to be heard. Don't focus on the words, focus on the behavior, Don would tell me. It isn't what they say, but what they don't say that you need to hear. Their behavior was a cry of pain, a scream for help, and a yelling for someone to hear their silence, hear what they were too afraid to voice in words. We actually called it behavior requesting. They were requesting with their behavior. The next time she comes back, notice her hands, Don told me regarding a child I had just seen. Too busy listening to whatever she was saying, I hadn't noticed her hands. That's your problem, Don reminded me. Her father repeatedly beat her with a garden hose. She made her hands into fists to kill him. She's gnawing on her fist, trying to chew off her own hands to keep from killing her father. Another example. My father fought in World War II. I grew up knowing 5 things about my father and the war. First, he and my mother had eloped during the war. 2, he was a gunner on a B-24 bomber. 3, he had a bullet hole scar on his arm. 4, his plane was shot down over Germany. And 5, he was a prisoner of war for 10 months. 50 years later, that's still all I knew, as I began research on combat experience for my master's thesis. I soon discovered there was a gigantic invisible experience that no one spoke of. From my father, I gleaned a tidbit. From another airman, a different piece. It was like a huge several thousand-piece jigsaw puzzle of an experience buried deep inside each one. None of them could voice it. Each one might slip out a different piece of that experience, but no one could express the whole. The pain was too deep, the horror too great. It existed screaming silently inside each of them. 3 years later, those 5 little things I knew about my father in the war turned into over 200 pages. I named it Listening to the Silence. I wept while I typed every page. Reality is a whole containing the visible and the invisible. Simultaneously and interpenetrated, the visible and the invisible interactively exist. We don't know the invisible pain carried by one another each week, those of us present here tonight, or those who are watching on the internet. We are unaware that who we are visibly is the invisible expressing itself in our lives. We are living icons. Our internal scars may be visible, like the girl's chewed on hands, or our internal scars may express themselves in our behavior. We behave the way we do because our behavior expresses non-verbally events, even events now forgotten by us, whether painful or not. Well, metaphors, intuitions, and imaginations. When you see without words, how do you communicate what you saw? Now experiencing the inexpressible for ourselves, in what way do we tell others? In a very real sense, we have asked the wrong question. As wonderful a question it is when one thinks about trying to communicate what one saw without words, such a question presupposes us to be actively in charge of creating the story of what we saw. What if we are not active creators and devourers of experience, but passive receivers of experience? First and foremost, our task is to experience the experience. Think of it. Experiencing the experience is a kind of a passive thing. I'm here letting something happen, and I'm not distracted here or there. I am not ignoring the experience that I'm experiencing. What if experience is passively experienced, that is, received, accepted, and then acted upon and lived out in our lives? Much the same as Grady seeing the hole, that door, the step, and navigating through the door down the step. He had to passively receive what he saw, and somehow passively receive the knowledge of that, and the evidence was he then acted upon the knowledge that he saw and knew without words. What if reality is an icon and the invisible, knowable source is revealing, speaking, showing us without words via the icon of whatever the visible is we're seeing, so that like Grady and Nicholas, not only we will know what we know without words, but we will also act upon and implement what we know in our lives. Grady navigated through the doorway. Nicholas tapped Father John on the back. Boy, I can't do this. I know I've got to keep moving. But if we experience passively and we can then know it and we act upon it, there is then an agreement between what we know and our behavior. I can't put it into words, but I went through the door. I can't put it into words, but I can tap Father John on the back. The agreement between what you know and how you're behaving. Versus living in the world of linguistic knowledge, where we tell our children, do as I say, not as I do. Because there's a disconnect between what we know linguistically and how we behave. We're all hypocrites. Only humans can be hypocrites. The hypocrisy of saying one thing and doing the contradiction of it. But what if we can know the whole, the invisible, and know it, and when we know it, we do it. And we're created to be able to do that, and every one of us once could. There was no disconnect between doorway, no disconnect between what they knew and what they did. Mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. So we have forgotten how to know. Well, we've learned how to learn words, names of stuff. What if, being made in the image of the source, we are able to experience the presence of the source, and the source partners with us, that we with our voice and it being I am, that we experience the presence and allow the presence to give voice through us in our behavior. Philosopher Martin Heidegger says that it is language that speaks in us, not we speaking it. As a philosopher, Heidegger contemplates the phrase, language speaks. It is the whole as we experience it that speaks and gives speech to us. Now, Heidegger was not a theologian, but it is as a philosopher that he cites the prologue of the Gospel of John, in the beginning the Word was with God. He cites it as an example that there are those who believe language is more than merely a human action, against the identification of speech as merely human performance. Others stress the word of language is of divine origin. In order for us to escape the claustrophobic imprisonment rationalism gives us and for us then to step into and enter the whole, the world of the visible and the invisible, which is both visible and invisible. We might enter, that we can enter into it, we can experience, which that moment is prior to speech, before we've learned our words. We must attempt to free the question of origin, in this case with Heidegger language, from the fetters of rational, logical explanation. He is saying, this is back in the 1970s when he wrote this, in order to deal with the question of origin, I don't know what page we're on.
282.
Who?
282.
282. In order to deal with the question of origin, you have to escape from the fetters of rational, logical explanation. Heidegger, the philosopher, does not speak of the divine. He references the Gospel of John only as an example of an approach to reality that is outside of and prior to the fetters of rationalism. You're asking, why do I care? Why are we talking about this? Because if we want to be able to hear the invisible, see the invisible, and not just be ourselves chained by the fetters of our language to see only the visible, we will never see the invisible until we get rid of the fetters that have chained our own minds to not be able to see. Somehow we've got to be set free from all our knowledge. We have to be set free from thinking with words. And for a moment to just experience the experience and let the experience, the presence that is there, speak to us, to hear it, to see something. We call it illumination in the church. It's real. And it can happen to us. It's happening all the time. But you have to turn aside to see the bush burning. Oh, that's a bush burning. That's interesting. Maybe I'll go get my lab book and we'll examine it and see what the temperature of the fire. For crying out loud, hear the voice. Okay, you get the point. That's what we're dealing with here, trying to crack through the fetters we don't even know we have. Heidegger, therefore, apotheosizes language when he says it is language that speaks. Language speaks. Without making language into the second person of the Trinity, he understands language as an invisible presence within the whole that expresses itself non-verbally and speaks verbally through us and our human speech. Heidegger removes Trinity from the "and God said, let there be light," and "in the beginning was the Word," and simply names the reality of the function. Something spoke. Prior to human speech, something spoke, and prior to human speech, we heard it. We knew it. That's a step and it's down. Without raising a religious perspective, Heidegger simply says, language speaks. However, coming from St. John's Gospel and using Heidegger's approach of being freed from our rationalistic fetters, we can say, since we are created to become like the image of the source within us, that by so doing and by experiencing the source, that the source could speak through us via our voice, as we give voice to that which we now in this moment of experience know without words what we know. We give voice to it by doing it and then pointing to it with our words. It is the Word speaking to us and giving voice within and to His creation. I know it's hard because we're talking about that which you have to see and not think. Because the minute you think, you used a word. And the minute you used a word, you just locked another lock on the fetters. How do I think without words? I got to somehow do that. Stop looking at my fingers and look between them. I got to see, because the minute I then do that, then these become blurry. You got it. We did that several weeks ago. Remember when we first started? We dealt with this issue of visible and invisible. Well, maybe this will help us. How are we doing on time? Okay. Wisdom, attend. Let us hear the Holy Gospel. John 14:7, if you had known me, you would have known my Father also. And from now on you know him and have seen him. He that has seen me has seen the Father. From now on you know him and have seen him, the Father. Because if you have seen me, you have already seen the Father. Then 2 Corinthians 5:16, therefore from now on we regard no one according to the flesh, even though we have known Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him thus no longer. Now we've got to confess that these words of Christ and St. Paul are not yet true for us. For most, if not all of us, we have only seen Christ according to the flesh. We know the story. We see a guy. We know some information. He was God, da-da-da-da. But we cannot say, I know him thus no longer. That I have seen and experienced the Father in him. That I have seen and experienced him beyond his flesh. That would be normal, according to what Christ said. You've already seen the Father if you've seen me. And was normal then for what Paul was saying to the Corinthians. Let me give you an example. In every liturgy, we hear the words, wisdom, attend, let us hear the Holy Gospel. Normally spoken by a deacon. And we think the gospel is the visible words of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But what words are immediately spoken after the deacon says, let us hear the Holy Gospel? It is not the reading of a gospel passage that comes next. It is our invisibly present God and Savior speaking through the priest, saying, peace be to all. Wisdom, attend, let us hear the Holy Gospel. What does the priest do? Peace be to all. Let us hear the Holy Gospel, and what's the very next thing you hear? Peace be to all. This is the greeting of the resurrected Christ when he appears in the upper room after his resurrection. Peace be to all. It is not the written words, but the living spoken words of the resurrected one in our midst. The resurrected one is in our midst, saying to us what he always says when he comes to his believers in the upper room: peace be to all. This is what the deacon is saying, Wisdom 10. Hear the Holy Gospel. Hear our living Savior say, peace be to all. It is his voice we are called to hear, speaking to us through the gospel readings. I might add, this is actually what we do every Monday night. Now, non-verbally, as the deacon, every Monday night, the function is still the same. Wisdom 10, let us hear the Holy Gospel. This forces us to ask the question, why have we come? You see, I am not the gospel. My words are not the gospel. I merely bear witness to the gospel. I point to the invisible one present among us, who is the gospel. I'm a nobody. I'm not a voice crying in the wilderness. I'm not even a weak whisper. I am not the door or even the front porch. I'm not even the sidewalk. I am a fellow pilgrim you have met on the way. And if you have come looking for the door, I assure you, ask and you shall receive directions. Seek the door and it will be found. And knock, and he who is the door will open it to you, and will open to you the way, the truth, and the life. Reality is a whole. The visible and the invisible are a whole. Paul in Colossians tells us Christ is the icon of the invisible Trinity. The more we experience the whole, that Christ is iconic, the greater will be the opportunity for us to experience the reality that if we have seen Jesus, we have seen the Father. If he's an icon, and greater will be the opportunity for us to confess with St. Paul, therefore from now on we regard no one according to the flesh. Even though we have known Christ according to the flesh, I've seen his icon, bought one in the bookstore, yet now we know him thus no longer. Which is why you see we don't worship an icon. We give our worship to the prototype who is God. Once we enter and begin experiencing the whole, within that iconic experience of the whole, the more we are aware of, once we are in the whole, the more we become aware of the phony limitations imposed by rationalism, restricting reality to only the visible. And in religious terms, the more we are aware of Protestantism restricting I am to the inky words of sola scriptura, restricting I am to their denominational understanding of him. The church fathers, especially Dionysius, in his divine name, certainly put an end to such nonsense. Our goal, our purpose, is to confess our gratitude at experiencing the whole. once more realizing we see the visible and the invisible. At the very least, we see or know there is a whole. That is to confess by now living in it, in the whole, in which we now know we live. It's not just words that I've learned on Monday nights. I know the visible is here, invisibly present, and I know that, and I will now live in that. Rather than just knowing it with words, I'm willing to begin living and knowing and becoming aware I'm surrounded with the invisible presence of the Creator. Living that. It is by living in the whole that we also become living icons of the whole. The very fact that you live, quote, as if you're in the whole, lets the others of us realize, well, maybe there is a whole. When you bump into someone that's behaving in agreement with reality of what they know and how they're living, it catches us off guard. We are called to be a living icon, bearing witness with our lives, in our lives and by our lives, that the invisible world and the invisible God exist. Wisdom attend. Let us hear the holy gospel. Someone who steals 10 times a day might decide one day to steal only 9 times. And this may be enough for God to enter in and remove from him his sinful ways. God's love is madness indeed. But the madness of God is infinitely wiser than the wisdom of men. Let us hear the Holy Gospel. Wow. Well, I know that was heavy. We're going to take a break, and today is Margaret's birthday. That's great, isn't it? Yeah. And I think there's plenty of goodies back there, so let's have a break, and everybody can say, you know, I can't sing, or we'd sing happy birthday. I'll forego the damage to your ears that would come. We'll take a break, and we'll come back in a little bit and do some more. Thank you. Now we come back to our theme, God as man, revealing God to mankind. Meaning, if Christ is the icon of the invisible God, so I'm just going to icon. Incarnation in the flesh, fully God, fully man. And I have to break that out. I could draw the line right here and put God on one side, man on the other. But I want to, if I put the God here, this is visible. And as visible humanity, he is revealing something about the Trinity, the functioning of God. Likewise, this is invisible. This is the visible icon. And as a visible icon, he is also revealing something about us. And even though we see ourselves as a visible us, he is going to reveal what we don't see about ourselves. So he is going to reveal with his visibility who we are to be. It is a two-way icon. God as man showing us who God is, how God behaves. God as man showing mankind who we are and how we are to behave. Remember, Don Dyer, the psychologist, turn off the sound, pay attention to the words. Pay attention to the behavior. How does God behave? How are we supposed to behave? These are not academic questions. They're not theological questions. They are so basic because where we started this, and once we got to the tree that wasn't chosen, we came back and saw that we were made in the image and we're supposed to achieve the likeness. What we're dealing right now is, what does the image look like? What does it mean there is an image? And if we're made in that image, the icon, then maybe we would have a clue to what it is we're supposed to become like. Rather than just having a slogan, theosis, become like the image within us, become like God, without ever entering into it and beginning to experience the doing of it. That's what we're doing. And I know it must feel like sometimes we're on a mountaintop and you can see what we're doing, and then we're down here tonight just slugging it out in the forest. Can't figure, boy, this is, okay. So, God is man revealing God to mankind. That's what we're doing. Colossians 1:15. He, the Son, is the icon of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities and powers, all things were created through him and for him. Isn't that interesting? Christ is the icon of the invisible God, and bingo, he is then the agent of creation. Creation and the function of Christ being the icon of God go together. That's why we're dealing tonight with creation. We're trying to understand, trying to see, not understand academically and intellectually, but to experience the reality of what Paul is seeing when he told us about this. He was describing a reality that he had experienced. The Son, the icon of the invisible I Am, is the agent of creation. Let us turn aside and consider creation functioning as an icon, the visible revealing the presence of the invisible. To identify the visible universe as creation, that meaning to use the term creation, is to reveal there is a creator. Let that soak in. Why does nobody use the word creation anymore? Because it reveals, in order to be creation, there had to be a creator. A rationalistic world doesn't exist. There is no creator, so there can't be the word creation. It's been eliminated from the vocabulary because the word itself is iconic. It reveals there is a creator. The term creation points to a beginning, a before, when creation had not been created. Science can talk about its Big Bang, but sure has the trouble knowing what in the world happened before. You can't comprehend there was a before without creation and a creator. The term creation is iconic. It reveals both there is a creator and there is a beginning. It does both just in that one word. So going beyond the term itself, creation, what does the event of creation reveal about the Creator? As we come to contemplate Jesus as the icon of the invisible God, perhaps we shall find Don Dyer's words helpful to us. Don't focus on the words, focus on the behavior. Focus on the behavior of what the source is doing. And when we finally get over here, we'll focus on the behavior. We may find listening to the creation story told with a different accent helpful. The creation, James Weldon Johnson. And God stepped out on space and he looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And as far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. The God smiled, and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other, and God said, that's good. Then God reached out and took the light in his hands, and God rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun, and he set that sun ablazing in the heavens. The light that was left from making the sun, God gathered it up in a shining ball and flung it against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and the stars. Then down between the darkness and the light, he hurled the world, and God said, that's good. Then God himself stepped down, and the sun was on his right hand, and the moon was on his left. The stars were clustered about his head, and the earth was under his feet. And God walked, and where he trod, his footsteps hollowed out the valleys and bulged the mountains up. And then he stopped and looked and saw that the earth was hot and barren. So God stepped over to the edge of the world, spat out the 7 seas. He batted his eyes and the lightnings flashed. He clapped his hands and the thunders rolled. And the waters above the earth came down, the cooling waters came down. Then the green grass sprouted and the little red flowers blossomed. The pine tree pointed his finger to the sky. The oak spread out his arms. The lakes cuddled down in the hollows of the ground, and the rivers ran down to the sea. And God smiled again, and the rainbow appeared and curled itself around his shoulder. Then God raised his arm, and he waved his hand over the sea and over the land, and he said, bring forth, bring forth. And quicker than God could drop his hand, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and seas, roamed the forest and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, that's good. Then God walked around, and God looked around on all that he had made. He looked at his sun, and he looked at his moon, and he looked at his little stars. He looked on his world with all its living things, and God said, I'm lonely still. Then God sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river he sat down. With his head in his hands, God thought and thought, till he thought, I'll make me a man. Up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay, and by the bank of the river he kneeled him down. And there the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the sky, who flung the stars to the most far corner of the night, who rounded the earth in the middle of his hand, this great God, like a mammy bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay, till he shaped it in his own image. Then into it he blew the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Amen. Amen. So what is it that God did? Yes, it is a Protestant sermon. Yes, it has theological errors that we would correct. Laying those aside, if we turn off the sound and just watch the behavior, what is it that God did? He stepped out of himself, created creation out of nothing, and then interacted with what he had created. That's what he did, regardless of what those words said that we would take exception with. Creation reveals there is a creator. The behavior of the creator in creating creation also reveals something about the creator. The sermon above says that the Creator created the universe because he was lonely. The preacher attributes a motive, a reason why the Creator created creation. He was lonely. The fact that the Creator was alone because there was nothing but the Creator does not imply the Creator was lonely. One can be alone and not be lonely. Ask a mother whether she's lonely when her children leave for school each day and she's left alone. At Christmas, needing to be alone to wrap presents doesn't make you lonely. Needing to be by yourself to do homework, write an essay, or work on a project does not make you lonely. For the ancient Greeks, their designer God creates because he abhors chaos and disorder. He is a God of order and beauty. For the Greeks, the beautiful exerts an irresistible attraction where the ugly provokes aversion. Plato's God creates because he must. Remember, he's the designer God. Love of the beautiful is dictated by the attraction exerted by the beautiful. Plato's God does not act out of freedom. He loves the beautiful because he must. He cannot resist being attracted to it. Likewise, Plato's God cannot love an ugly man or a sinner. The God of Plato has no freedom, in contrast to the God of Christians who love sinners and the ugly, perhaps even more than those who are beautiful and good. I think that was Sunday's parable of the Pharisee and the publican. Love of someone ugly or of the sinner, on the contrary, is not dictated by any attraction, that is, by any necessity. It is an act of absolute freedom. You see, the attribute we attribute to the Creator is important. He's lonely, so he did it. He only loves the good and the beautiful, and so he rearranges the ugly chaos into something pretty. Or he did it because he was free to do whatever he wanted to do. That's why he did it. The complete freedom to be who he is and do what he wills. Therefore, the Christian God does not create because he loves the beautiful and wants to give form and beauty to the world. He creates because he wills something else to exist other than himself, something with which to have dialogue and communion, interaction. He creates because he wants to give existence to something that in no way existed before, out of nothing. Therefore, creation presupposes an act of God which brings into existence something other than and outside of himself, a creation, which is located not in him, but vis-a-vis, opposite, in relationship to him and with him. This is what we see in creation. We do not see a lonely God. As Trinity within itself, the source is not lonely. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Inside the Trinity, they're not lonely. We see the source acting outward, outside itself, creating something other than itself. In the Greek language, this is called ecstasis. Ek, out. Stasis, to stand. To stand outside yourself. Literally what the term means. The relationship between creator and creation results from ecstasis. We're learning something being revealed by this behavior. The Greek term ecstasis is a compound of ek and stasis. Ecstasis means to stand outside oneself. Our English word ecstatic carries an implication of someone being in a frenzy or an excited state in which their behavior is outside of normal behavior. They're beside themselves. And our English term ecstasy often implies sexual or erotic feelings. So let us be clear. By our use of ecstasis, we do not mean either of these contemporary English understandings, whether out of your mind or sexual. By use of ecstasis, we do not mean either. Our use of ecstasis is based on the original basic meaning, acting outwardly towards another versus acting inwardly towards oneself. When speaking of God, the idea of ecstasis signifies that God is love, and as such, He creates an immanent relationship of love outside of Himself. Love as ecstasis means the affirmation of the other as other, and not for the meeting of the needs of the self that loves only to meet the desires of the self. In other words, remember when we were looking at the word person, and person is a word that has relationship so that it takes two people, and in this moment, person to person, I can respond to Jerry as other. Since we don't have husband-wife, we got the two terms. We don't have in English another term for person. So we can use the word other, and we mean the other of the pair in being personhood at that moment. And it implies that I am reaching out and treating the other as a total other for the benefit and sake of the other. Ecstasis. I am not treating Jerry nice to get something out of Jerry. The arrows would have pointed inward. I am a selfish person, and it's all about me. And Jerry, what can you do for me? So I will butter Jerry up so he'll do something. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? God did not create creation because He needed something to make Him feel good. He was not lonely. He did step out of Himself. He interacts with His creation, but not because He's lonely, not because He needs us to meet His needs. He wants to meet your need. He wants to interact with you so you will become the unique and unrepeatable person that you are. You are unique and unrepeatable, and He wants to interact with every single one of us on this planet, the good, the bad, and the ugly, with a heavy emphasis on the bad and the ugly, which gets most of us. Though we think we fit into the good. That's why He died for us. He died for the good people, really. Not those bad people on the other side of town. Whichever side of town that happens to be, I don't know. In personhood, there is no self. Let us deny ourself and let the arrows go outward. For in it, every self exists only in being affirmed. I need you to affirm me, to make me feel good, to bless me, rather than contrasting itself with the other. All this calls for a reconsideration of the concept of love. Love is not a feeling or disposition of a self. That is an individual with the arrows turned inward. Self and selfish, they're the same word. Everything is being absorbed inward. It has nothing of selfishness towards the other. It is a gift. Love is a gift coming from the other, as an affirmation of our uniqueness and indispensable relationship which exists as other to them. Love is something I receive from Jeff because he gives it. He accepts me for who I am, warts and all. Just for the heck of it. I have the choice of what I do with that. I can be threatened by that kind of acceptance, that kind of love. I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's the gimmick? What's in it for him? I'm being set up, I know. Play all kinds of games. Reject. Throw rocks. I can go ahead and use him. And because he's a person, being a person to me, he lets me get away with it. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Or I can be transformed by the fact that he loves me anyway. That he even let me get away with it. And maybe that transforms me. So that I finally begin to let him be him. I don't know why you love me, Jeff, but I'm going to let you. That's who this Creator is. That's what creation is revealing to us. That's what ecstasis reveals. So the guy stole 10 times every day, till one day he only stole 9. And God said, "That a boy." The madness of God, the madness of being ecstatic towards His creation is mind-boggling. A while ago when I said, Wisdom of 10, let us hear the Holy Gospel, and I quoted that story from Archimandrite Zacharias, you all thought, that's not the gospel. That's a funny gospel. It is the gospel. It is the gospel of ecstasis, the gospel of love. Interacting with us for our best interest in salvation, and even letting us say no to it. I'm jumping way ahead, but he didn't stop being ecstatic towards us when we killed him. He let us kill him. Okay, creation is telling us something about this God. This incarnate one is revealing him as the creator, and the creation is ecstatic. It is the act of creation, the creator ecstatically creating outside of himself a creation that is other, entirely other. This behavior, this ecstasis, is the behavior labeled love. Creation is ecstatic. It is an act of love. This behavior, this ecstatic act, reveals something about Trinity. God is love. Creation reveals that by being ecstatic. Having been created in the image of an ecstatic deity means we are created with the purpose and potential of behaving ecstatically, outwardly, outside ourselves, toward the other, and in behalf of the other, whomever the other may be who is standing in front of us. Same time, same station, next week. God bless you. See you then.